You ready?
Congratulations.
Good. Well, welcome everyone to the first 2014 Institute for Immigration Research monthly colloquium. I'm glad you could come. And Jane and Henrici, we're very glad to have you here from the Institute for Women's Policy Research. I'm going to skip all the good things about your career here, other than a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin and a master's degree from the University of Chicago. And you do work all over the place on gender and migration. So welcome, and we're eager to hear what you have to say.
Thank you so much. I'm very, very honored to be here. This is very exciting, and I look forward to your questions. I am going to advance this manually rather than use the remote, since I haven't tested it out, and I just want to move forward. So I am a senior consultant with research affiliate with the IWPR. I'm also at George Washington University in the Global Gender Program, and have had the honor of teaching a course here at George Mason, in fact. So I do research on a range of topics, which I will be discussing a bit throughout this talk. But the focus I want to have today is on specifically gender and migration in U.S. policy and planning. I'm going to be giving the talk in 3 different sections, and if there's time at the end, I have some ideas for future research that I'd like to share with you, things that I would love for those of you in this room and those who will be watching to be able to undertake either with me or independently, as you will. But that's only if we have time, and if there is not time, if I run out of it, what I'll do is share that with you later via email. So to get started, this is the first part of the talk, the background about gender and migration and policy. And just to start, the focus will be on sort of a general review, I think, for many of you with respect to gender and migration. So, as you're probably aware, gender and migration has quite an extensive focus as a topic, both among policymakers and among researchers and service providers. However, it's been sporadic, spotty. It's increased in intensity over the last few decades. In part, that has to do, we think, with the fact that there's been a rising percent of women relative to men who have migrated across different boundaries, both state lines and international borders. Within the United States, just specifically, just in terms of numbers, not in terms of those migrating, but those who report residing within the United States, since 1960, that is to say, prior to 1960, it tended to be more men, more males living within the United States who were foreign-born. Since 1960, there's been roughly parity between males and females, and that's of all ages, and that includes those who could have entered at any point. That is to say, they could have aged in the United States, and that's sort of one of the topics I want to get to as we move forward. So gender and migration, I want to go first over some of the aspects that cover both men and women. So they might do so in order to further their education, find work, escape political turmoil, have greater independence in terms of the society or politics, and also both men and women might be trying to escape gender violence. Now, at the same time, women, in comparison to men who migrate worldwide, tend to experience discrimination and harassment in greater frequency than men. Men describe harassment of all sorts, but what we found in our research is that often when men describe their fears, it has to do with respect to women, their inability or their concern for women or children and the need to protect them. Women, meanwhile, are more likely than men to report experiencing workplace violence and harassment. I want to remind everybody that, of course, migration isn't always voluntary. It can involve what we call displacement, also trafficking. I won't spend time in this talk going into those. These are just reminders. In addition, despite stereotypes, not all women who migrate are mothers or have babies either in their sending nation or when they arrive. So that brings me to a few points that I want to make that have to do with some of the theories that we use when examining gender and migration. There's heterogeneity. Again, for you, I know this is a review, but just to make it clear, these are some of the points that affect research as well as policy. So with respect to that heterogeneity, that's true not only for those who are migrants and immigrants, but for those in the receiving nations, those where they come. That's important to keep in mind in terms of the aspects of identity, of the different types of conflicts and frictions, but also things people can find in common. However, one of the aspects that I want to also point out with respect to policy and programming is that despite that heterogeneity, we still tend to think in homogeneous terms. So now, going back a second, I want to focus just on gender. So some key points, we should always define what we're talking about with respect to gender. Typically, when we talk about gender, and I've used already terms like male and female, men and women, I don't know if you heard that, but I use them interchangeably. I did not say masculine and feminine, although that is actually the origin of, in English, the word that we're talking about when we say gender. In common use, especially in policy, we see that gender tends to be a gloss, a reference only for women, only for the female. And then everybody says, oh, but we also should be talking about men. Well, if we use the word gender, that is supposed to be implicit, but again, you have to be explicit to make sure everybody's on the same page. And then again, as with gender and migration in general, gender, the concept, tends to get stereotyped. So here's a definition that I've been working on. It's very cumbersome. I'm not entirely satisfied with it, but it kind of covers a lot of the different aspects that we're going into with respect to gender. Now, this is a definition that I worked out because I was asked to write an encyclopedia entry, so it had to be solid and comprehensive. Really key points with respect to gender that tie into that, though, are easier to say. Gender receives treatment. It's not only what you express and what you adopt, but how you're treated. That treatment can be unequal in terms of your gender. This matters in terms of resources, power, all sorts of aspects with respect to migration and immigration. It is sociocultural, it is contextual. And that means it's not innate, but it is also not fixed. I mentioned that because one of the issues that comes up when we talk about policy and programming is the excuse, oh, it's cultural, as if that means it can't be changed. Culture does change. It doesn't mean people do it willingly or easily, or that you can make them do it or should make them do it, but it can and does change. So this is a complicated little chart that I worked out for this talk. That if you'll bear with me, I'm going to show you, just to show some analogies that I have to make. Because within migration and immigration, it's also important to reference what I was talking about a bit earlier when I said age, for example, parental status. And as I move forward through the talk, some of these other characteristics are going to become particularly salient. So, citizenship as an identity tends to be, in most nations, something that can come with a rubber stamp, that can come with certification, that is formalized, that is documented. We know it's not always the case. We know this is problematic. Documents themselves, identifications, huge issues of debate. I recognize this. At the same time, typically in most nations, there is some sort of procedure. I mention that because then nationality, by contrast, is what we associate with what someone carries with them regardless of where they are, and there's no paperwork necessarily available to prove how you feel, how someone treats you in terms of your nationality. And you can be anywhere on the planet, living anywhere on the planet, and have a nationality. We say country is the geopolitical unit and nationality is the culture. Age and generation, analogous. You might not feel that you're the millennial generation, the Facebook generation. I don't know what you call yourselves. Anyone in the room? I know I tend not to match up with those little tests that I like to take in terms of what generation are you. Age, meanwhile, tends to come with documents in most nations, even though nations might differ in terms of the calendar, the religion, whether it's connected to the solar system or whatever. But typically there is a formal system that we use to calculate age. Now, all of these intersect, all of these overlap, and sex and gender likewise. Sex is also unfixed, like age, like citizenship, but sex tends to come with paperwork. It tends to be a decision. There tends to be a formal process that associates with your sexual identity, even though you might change it later on. Gender, meanwhile, again, how you feel, how you were treated, ethnicity and heritage. Oh, sorry about that dangling H there. In heritage, but ethnicity and heritage, again, not fixed, but usually in certain cases we can figure out some sort of document, some sort of trace that you've left in paperwork, whereas race, right, you might self-identify in terms of a certain race, is cultural. It's a cultural category, exclusively. Socioeconomic class, income and wealth, health, mobility, disability status are also very salient when we're talking about immigrants, especially within the United States. All right, these are aspects of all migration and gender, but in the United States, as I'll talk about with respect to my research that I've found, these are characteristics that come up again and again. So I need to be clear which migrants I'm talking about, which women of whom I'm speaking. So now, to turn to the U.S. policy and planning part. Very briefly, and I really won't go through this list, but I want to just summarize it by saying that I've worked on many different projects with a number of amazing scholars. I feel very fortunate to have had that opportunity, as well as graduate students and undergraduates in different cities and different regions. We've used a variety of methods. And mixing methods is something that if we have time, I'll talk about. I strongly advocate, especially when it comes to low-income migrants and immigrants. And I can explain that in more detail if you'd like. I strongly advocate mixing methods. It's something I teach and push for. So one project on which I had the good fortune to work is called the 3-City Study, Boston, San Antonio, and Chicago, and I was the project manager for San Antonio. So this is an example of tying policy to research, mixed methods, and migration, gender, and the stereotypes that I mentioned earlier. The stereotype, as I'm sure you've heard, about especially women immigrants in the United States is that they abuse the system. They take advantage of all of these benefits that are just around they can get. When in fact, what we found in our research is that there is some use, depending on eligibility, of course, when the person arrived in the United States, whether or not they do have children, how old the children are, their income level, and so on and so forth. But that too often, we found in this project, as have other scholars and other research, benefits, when available, are underutilized. That is to say, if a child could get dental coverage, wouldn't it be better, or isn't it better for the larger community that the child receive treatment, preventative treatment, than emergency care afterwards? That's the sort of argument that, with respect to policy and programming, comes up So you find the evidence, you find what's happening, you dig into it. It contradicts the stereotype, but it's always complicated. It's never a yes, no. At the same time, what we find in terms of probability is that it's an underutilization, definitely a lack of coverage, although that's something, as we'll talk about with respect to the Affordable Care Act, could be shifting. So, policy and programming definitely tie in to these issues. Again, low income and low asset. Sorry, I should mention, they're distinct because in the United States, we measure poverty with respect to income levels. Income, of course, just being whatever you bring in. Assets being related to your wealth, so that assets minus debt is a very different picture than your income. So trying to look at both, which affect different types of policies and different types of benefits in the United States. We find a few other issues to mention. One of them that I find interesting with respect to some of my research that I've been doing with the Institute for Women's Policy Research on African American women displaced by Katrina. Now, they're not refugees, they're not foreign born, but they are displaced. They are considered internally displaced migrants. The scholarship shows with respect to that population, and my own research corroborates this, as well as other migrants and immigrants, that women, once displaced, once migrated, tend to stay longer than men. Low-income women, excuse me. Much of the scholarship argues that this could be because of the types of jobs that low-income women get versus low-income men. That the jobs that women can get are more reliable, are easier to find, are less seasonal than the jobs that low-income migrant and displaced men can get. I'm not going to dispute that. I'm not going to say that's false. But one of the issues that I found in my work that corresponds with what some other researchers have also found is that, in fact, another issue pertains. That women, low-income women, foreign-born, native-born, tend to have greater social isolation and less mobility. So I show a bicycle because I don't know how many of you have conducted research just in this region in Northern Virginia, but the research that I've done in Northern Virginia, low-income men looking for work often ride bicycles if they're not allowed to have driver's licenses or whatever reason, whereas the women tend not to. They don't even have access to that. They don't feel they have access to. They can't bring their children with them. Many reasons. So less mobility, more isolation also means less mobility in terms of return migration, ending displacement, if that's what you're seeking. One more point that I want to make before I go into a little bit more about the specific project that I want to focus on today. This has to do with wages, so that even when employed, even when they are employed, regardless of the type of job, low income and low asset women who are migrants, especially those who are foreign born now, typically experience lower wages and higher poverty rates, and that correlates to some of the health and disability issues that I mentioned a moment ago. And that's including less than their male counterparts. I'm not going to go through this list. This is a huge laundry list of all of the different issues that gender and migration within U.S. policy that have importance within U.S. policy and programming. What I'm highlighting here are those that I'm going to be focusing on now with respect to this particular project. As you see, it's still quite a few. Now, these are the projects with which I've done research in recent years, last 5 years in fact, with the Institute for Women's Policy Research. They involve the work that we conducted in Atlanta, Northern Virginia, and Phoenix to do with organizations specifically helping Latina low-income immigrant women. Also the Katrina project that I'm wrapping up now, which is a long-term, both of those were long-term multi-method studies, although the Katrina project was primarily ethnographic. And that also involved 3 cities. You see a pattern here. Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and Houston. And then these 2 projects having to do specifically with in-home care workers. And that brings me to the focus on today's talk. So, caring for workers and workers who care. The first part, caring for workers. So, we had done research on low-income women in migration, immigration, in different parts of the United States. We wanted to continue that research, and we approached different funders and discussed with them what were some of the key policy issues moving forward with respect to women, explicitly women, in the United States. There were a range of issues. There's reproductive health, there's different voter access to being able to vote. There are all sorts of different issues, of course. Remember the laundry list. But one that came up that was particularly focused had to do with working with care workers, in-home care workers, in part because a coalition was forming. Now, what we have found is that this is happening in migration, immigration issues in the United States on a number of topics. All of those that I mentioned, including care work. We're finding that unions, national organizations, national various types of legal and human rights organizations, organizations that work with health, are coming together to work with immigrants and migrants on these different topics to make change. In fact, one observation that I have to pull away from the work that I did on this project is that the successful campaigning, and we have been successful. I mean, there are 200 of us in terms of, organizations, not 200 individuals, 200 organizations at least involved. So it takes a lot of work. But where we have been successful in making change, it involves bringing everyone to the table. So it's not just the coalitions, the unions, the advocates, the researchers, universities, all of the above, but also employers and employers' rights advocates, so that you see, especially when it comes to care work, as I'll talk about, there are disability rights advocates and elder care rights advocates, the elderly rights advocates. All of them need to be at the table, talking to each other to get things out immediately so that compromises are made in place. Seems to be successful. Again, I'm not going to go through this list. This is just a subset. This is just to show you some of the different organizations that worked with us, that we worked with. Although I will mention that for these particular reports, the Ms. Foundation, Open Society Foundation, and Annie E. Casey Foundation did the funding. We've had funding from different sources for the different projects, but these 3 for this particular project. And Caring Across Generations is the key coalition with which we worked. They also supported our project. Now, some basic facts. In the United States, we have an aging population. This has been predicted for decades. This should not be sudden news, but for some it is. With that aging population, we also have certain policies in place so that it is a law in the United States that those who are elderly have the right to be able to stay in their own home. They cannot be forcibly moved. They cannot be displaced. They can, what we call, age in place. This affects planning, this affects economies, this affects jobs. At the same time, how do they pay for this? That's a complicated issue. We also have disability rights, so that those who are able to stay at home and get care in their home have the right to do so. And it is the law that states must make accommodations for this. So these are 2 policies already in place before these changes, before the relatively rapid aging of the United States. On top of that, we have technologies changing. I don't know if you can see this, it's a little bit light. It says self-assist technologies proliferating. Now, when I say self, what I mean by that is, for example, being able to check your heart rate, being able to check your blood pressure, sugar level, informally speaking. This is not necessarily something that you physically can do, but that with help, you do not necessarily require a physician, all right, or even a licensed practitioner, medical practitioner. All of these aspects have affected the rapid growing demand for in-home care. The work is hard, and it is often low pay. Now, there are different types of in-home care. In-home care is a subset in our legal system of this country of direct care. Under direct care, we have what is called personal care, and we have what's called home health. Personal care, to be a personal care aide, you are required no training, no certification, no background. I could contract any one of you, you could contract me to be a personal care aide. I would not be entitled to minimum wage, certainly not to overtime, and certainly not to benefits. It might involve my cooking, should you like it. It might involve my helping you, say get dressed, move to the car, drive you, that sort of thing. However, home health aides do require a minimum of 75 hours of training, which is then certified by a nurse. Most states in the United States require more than 75 hours. But this is something we want to talk about today. How many more? What should that involve? The majority, 90% of those working for wages as in-home care are women in the United States. Globally, it's probably comparable, but that's just the United States. Over half are women of color, 56%. Over a fourth, now this is all direct care workers. No, I'm sorry, these are in-home workers. Over a fourth are foreign-born. That means the majority are not foreign-born. Please keep that in mind too. Sometimes reporters, when I talk to them, that gets confusing. The majority are native-born, but a significant percentage are foreign-born. In addition, when you think native-born, keep in mind how diverse this nation is. Do not forget what I was talking about with respect to intersectionality. Age, culture, language, dialect. All right? Keep all of that in mind. When I say culture too, think in terms of when you medicate, when you won't medicate, whether or not you consider vitamins a medication. All of these sorts of issues come into place. Now, in addition, at the same time, caregivers, those who are unpaid, the majority at the present are women. That's changing. More and more men are providing unpaid care for relatives, for neighbors, but currently the majority are women. They tend to be middle-aged, and they tend, by the majority, to be those who are unpaid, to also be women of color. Since caring for someone else is hard labor, what you are talking about is a population that itself is endangering its health to care for others. They are risking backs, all sorts of neck injuries, exposure to contagious disease, et cetera, and themselves will probably need care. Now that's both foreign-born and native-born. Everyone, I would say, likes the idea of more training. That is to say, those who are providing the care have stated in multiple research projects that they would like more training, that they would find their job easier to do with additional training, whether it's about safety, how to lift properly, whether it's about how to get access to medication. I'll show you some of the ideas that people have for more training. And those who receive care would like better trained people for the most part. It's how much is it going to cost, and do I have to pay for it, and when can it be done, and will I then lose the person once she's trained? So these are among the many preferences that those who provide in-home care have said that they would like to learn more about. Conflict resolution, being able to access on the internet more medical help. You might find that problematic. You might wonder about training someone to do that sort of thing. But if you don't have any experience in it, and you're trying to communicate with somebody who speaks in a different dialect, a different language, who comes from a different generation, don't forget that's also a culture, all of these aspects can affect your work relationship and your issues of abuse, your issues of safety, and whether or not you should stay. These were aspects that I found after doing all of my research for this project through literature review and also through speaking with experts and programs around the United States. Basically, you have to find a way to subsidize your covered cost. Somehow, some way. There has to be involved on-the-job training, but at the same time, one of the things that we found mention of is that, for example, if you do training within, say, a healthcare facility, often those who have licenses, such as physicians, treat those without licenses with disrespect. It might come as a shock that this happens. You also need peer support for that very sort of circumstance to protect against that. Someone with whom you can speak, who can give you some support, feedback, emotional support and feedback. Something that we often don't like to talk about, but is a necessary factor as well, is English as a second language, or English for speakers of other languages, as it's known more broadly. When I say we don't necessarily like to discuss it, it's because, oh, we want people to already know English, or we say to ourselves, we already know English. All of us can always learn more English. All of us can always improve in our communication skills. It is what it is. This has been found, however, to be a key factor in improving training for in-home care workers. Child care vouchers, housing and transportation vouchers, those are nice as well. So, I went through a number of programs, and I hope that you have a chance to look through the report. It's available online. I'll give you the URL at the end of the talk. You can download it for free, and I list different programs, but here, just to give you an example of 3 different types, one that includes ESL, one that doesn't, but is considered very, very highly regarded, I should say, in terms of the types of health care that's provided, and then another that's within institutional settings. Just to focus on the first one, Carreras en Salud, to begin. I want to mention that one of the things that impresses me about this is that it pulls together from projects that I've also done having to do with education and low-income women. It provides childcare on site. In addition, it provides what are called stackable credentials. Now, stackable means that someone can test and enter in at a different phase. Kind of like what you do within college when you test out of a certain language capability or mathematical capability. So that if you do not need certification in one area, you can move on to the next. To get that type of flexibility, though, really requires attention to detail, and typically you don't process or graduate a large quantity of students. So, scalability is another issue. That I can't speak to here. I mention it in the report, I mention it to you now, but it's something that really needs to be considered. So everyone is talking about training, but how to keep it whether or not to make it mandatory and how to keep it And now, related to that, U.S. policy. Where we have been successful, among others, that is to say, working with other groups, is to help the administration push in a direction that it was already leaning toward, which is to change the regulation in the Fair Labor Standard Act so that it's clarified. That is to say, if I am a home health worker and I am working in your home for more than a certain number of hours, providing a certain type of care, in fact, I am now eligible for minimum wage and possibly overtime. It's a radical shift. In addition, though, the Workforce Investment Act, which helps to subsidize ESL classes, as well as adult literacy, that needs to be reauthorized. It's just limping by right now. Violence Against Women Act needs reauthorization, similarly, and it has particular salience with respect to helping to protect immigrant women. But immigrant women in particular, of course, could use work visa reform. I won't go into detail with respect to comprehensive immigration reform. I will mention, though, for our other report that we did with respect to visas, that we found that generally speaking, unless it's opened up so that more non-professional visas are made available and work visas allow mobility from job to job, you're pretty much stymieing and keeping in for the potential of abuse women who are providing this type of work. And again, let me remind you, this is a growing field. There is demand growing, both native-born and foreign-born. So it is a workforce development issue. Other recommendations that I found talking to labor unions, to immigrant rights activists, and to workers themselves who do in-home care work are a little bit more creative and less specifically about policy, and although it overlaps, and more about programming. So digital technologies that can help you keep track of your hours. This is going to matter if there is comprehensive immigration reform, that people be able to prove the hours that they did and have signatures that they can show that they did so. That's just an example, and you're probably not going to want it on paper because it can get lost. That's an example. All the way down through issues of disaster conditions, having your records in some way that you can show so that you can receive protection and services under any circumstance. Now, this is something that is brand new. Well, that is, it came out last fall, but we had a sequester in the United States so that many government agencies were not able to really push mention of this just yet. You will be hearing about this from the Department of Education, all right? OECD produced a report about skills. The United States is a nation among those that was analyzed. So within the United States, how did the U.S. fare in terms of skill development? Again, we're talking workforce development here. Poorly, native-born and foreign-born. Both need skill development. Skill development is not the same thing as educational level. Skill development has to do with problem solving, has to do with various types of skills. It apparently does not explain gender gaps. That is to say, there's relative gender parity in terms of in the United States in terms of skill level. At the same time, skills are increasingly very necessary, we find in the United States. So that literacy of all types, literacy in terms of health literacy, literacy in terms of being able to help your students, but also your children navigate the school system. I don't know how many PhDs it takes to read an application form just to get any type of benefit in this country. But let me tell you, I find it very challenging. Those are skills. Those are the types of literacy skills. All sorts of skills are necessary, but also we're talking, of course, digital, technological skills, driving ability. There are many different types of skills. One thing I did not know until looking at this report, that they find that it is associated also with overall well-being. So now, as I said, if I had time, I would talk about the types of research that I have some ideas about doing. First, though, I just want to say very quickly that I'm going to just stop here, but say and just share with you that, first of all, these programs that I mentioned to you, evaluations are still needed. So any of you who do evaluations or who encourage evaluations, teach evaluations, there are some evaluations that exist about the programs. They always need more. Proof is needed always that these programs work and what can be scaled up, as I say, to expand, to reach the needs of the workforce. In addition, more research is needed, continued mixed research methods, using mixed research methods on some of the effects on low-income women of the different health changes and the aging that is happening across the United States. Literacy issues, as I mentioned, including English as a second language, remain important. So that OECD data, which is publicly available, and you can log on, I'll release the website in a minute, to gain access to getting at that data, doing more analyses, is something that I encourage all of you to consider. Also going forward with respect to US policy, the Affordable Care Act is about to make a huge difference. It's going to increase demand for non-physicians, that is to say those who can do health care, those who can provide health care, but who aren't necessarily at the level of physicians and specialists. So more nurses, but also more in-home care workers. So already this was a growth field. This is probably going to be of even greater growth, but for those with training. How is this going to impact immigrant women? At the same time, how is that possibility of coverage now going to impact those who are the foreign-born who have lived here some time? In addition, I don't know if you are aware, but refugees now have access within the ACA to certain kinds of coverage. That's another research area. So with that, the reports that I mentioned that we did at the Institute for Women's Policy Research are all available at that website. And if you have more questions, or if you have questions, excuse me, I hope you have questions now, but if you have additional ones later, please email me. Thank you. So I think we have a few minutes for questions.
Questions?
I have a comment and a question. I would personally make sort of 5 some more salient variable in your analyses. And could you maybe shortly tell me the political hang-up with VAWA?
There's been so first let me address the socioeconomic class. As I said, it tends to be measured by income, and I know you know that. So income level is kind of insufficient. So that's one of the reasons I just leave it to one side. But I agree with you, it is critical. With respect to VAWA, the debate in Congress that took place went in many different directions, one of which argued that people were going to abuse the opportunity to claim that they had been abused to gain access to certain protections.
Mm.
You've mentioned that a significant number of the women or individuals in home care were foreign-born. Where were they from?
Good question. It's a range of nations, actually, including I have the majority listed, but I believe it was the Caribbean and Latin America, the majority. But all over, including Europe.
You mentioned in particular that additional evaluation of a number of the programs is crucial. And in my mind, it's crucial not just for our own knowledge as to whether or not these programs and policies are working, but also to provide additional evidence for policymakers.
Absolutely.
For making additional decisions. What other kinds of research can you envision in this area would be most critically useful in the coming, let's say, year to 2 years, that would get policymakers' attention as we're starting to move back towards conversations around immigration reform?
I repeat that the Affordable Care Act is very important. We need to be in position and moving forward. The Office on Women's Health in the Department of Health and Human Services is interested. You might get in touch. There is a wide range. There's a room, in other words, for all sorts. Let me go back. I'm just demand for health, in-home health care, demand for trained and certified, the potentially greater access to coverage, and the effects of the coverage to become available to those with refugee status. But also, although it can make us uncomfortable, we need to know the numbers. We need to know the facts too. And I say numbers, but also in-depth facts, circumstances, conditions, with respect to disabilities and what are called deficiencies among the foreign-born. Integration is not improving. That is to say, when someone comes in with limited skills into the United States, that isn't true of all countries, but into the United States, integration of the length of time that that person stays here is not apparently making any difference. It's not changing, it's not improving their development of skills at this point. Now, you can say, well, why do we want them? Well, why do we want to worry about them? Several reasons. I don't need to say I'm sure to this audience, but I will say it. One, because this is affecting the native born as well. These are not just issues that are limited to the foreign born. Two, again, workforce development, larger demand. Meet the demand with skilled workers. And then three, again, leaving aside the moral, leaving aside the humane. These are programs that can help us going forward for all populations as they enter. So this is a topic that has come up again and again with colleagues of mine at the Department of Education, at Migration Policy Institute, at Georgetown, a lot of different places in different ways. Everybody has different ideas about how to respond, but we know that more research is still needed. We know certain numbers, but more research and analysis is still needed. And as I say, let me find that. This is the website, if you are interested. You have to gain permission to access this data. But I don't know how difficult it is. I just haven't had time this week to do it myself, but I plan to do so. And then they're going to start putting out calls for papers. This is going to be a push of the Department of Education. There is going to be a demand. Now, whether or not there's going to be funding for you to do the research, I can't say, but there's going to be a demand. People need to be analyzing this material in every which way and form. For example, what are the differences among women of different age groups, of different entry points into the United States, of different disability status? So say if I have a physical disability, diagnosed physical disability, am I more likely to be more skilled or less skilled? I can answer that I'm more likely to be in poverty and vice versa. But with respect to skills, we need more data. And then child disability. That I can't speak to. I have not done research on it. I have done lots of research with mothers of children who are diagnosed with disabilities. It is a very expensive household. Very, very expensive situation. And it lasts sometimes with increasing costs for lifetimes. But more research on that is needed as well, with respect to those who are foreign born, and not just with respect to those who are. Those would be some, I'm sorry if I gave you too many, but I can always think of more ideas for more research. But yes, I would say the Affordable Care Act is, in addition to comprehensive immigration reform, being ready and already going on research on that is pretty critical.
Time for one more question or comment?
I have a question. So, could you just, would you say that people, the older generation, maybe 65 and above in the U.S., they prefer to go to in-home care workers, seek help from in-home care workers and not professional nurses. Is there any evidence or data to support that at presently?
All right, so let's see how I can say, because I know we don't have much time, and it's a good question, and I want to be able to answer it fairly but quickly. So in general, a nurse is not somebody who does in-home care necessarily. An in-home, especially because of cost, you can have an in-home care worker who has, as I said, no training or limited training. But let's say you want somebody with some training, all right? So you go through a system, or you have someone like your daughter often go through the system and interview people. Another question you might ask yourself is, do the elderly in the United States prefer someone of a similar culture and sex? And that is the case. So right now, in the United States, the majority of the elderly are women. That's changing. But right now, the majority are women. The majority, again, this is changing, might be of European ancestry. I'm not sure if the majority speak English, but they tend to prefer someone with whom they imagine that they are able to communicate quickly and whose cooking they like, honestly. It's part of it too. So trust, a sense of communication, a sense of shared culture, these are all critical. But now let's say you bring in somebody who is more affordable. The tensions and the problems in terms, again, of abuse can happen in both directions. This is one of the things we want to address. I can't honestly say that the majority would prefer an in-home care worker to a nurse. I can say that in terms of cost, that is what they're getting, and they do prefer someone with the same cultural background. I hope that answered your question.
Well, thank you very, very much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, that's wonderful.
Yeah.